As has been said in the introduction, I've spent many years of my life working in the heritage conservation field at the World Monuments Fund. Our role there was to...
Nuestra regla allí era tratar de gestionar proyectos utilizando apoyo catalizador y combinando la participación del sector privado y el sector público. Durante ese tiempo descubrí que los recursos con los que teníamos que trabajar y los esfuerzos colectivos eran tantos, pero no eran suficientes. Entonces pasé los últimos años trabajando en investigación y en el desarrollo de una nueva estrategia que está enfocada en mejorar la interacción entre el sector privado y el sector público. La financiación pública se da en la forma de la filantropía. Ahora les voy a preguntar si pueden ver, por favor, la primera parte de la presentación. Entonces, les pido perdón de antemano por hablar en inglés. Espero que esta presentación les resulte interesante y que la puedan escuchar todos en Latinoamérica.
Our funding is typically limited to the three lowest tiers of this vortex or pool of financing. The public funding that's allocated by governments, intergovernmental funds that come typically from development banks and institutions of that kind, and philanthropic funding, both from local partners, from businesses that may be involved in sponsorship, and very limited international philanthropic funding. And having looked at the way other sectors finance themselves, in particular the environmental conservation sector, I began to realize that organizations working in those fields have many more avenues for resources and have specifically begun working to create models for projects that are focused on nature conservation, forest conservation, agricultural land, fisheries, and the ocean that engage much wider funding sources and use innovative strategies in order to secure those funds. And so this is what I've been looking at now in relation to the work of the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance. And so if you look at this chart, there are 7 tiers that more or less represent a global marketplace. Sorry, there are 6 tiers. Starting with the core funding from the governmental sector and others that align themselves with the governmental sector, transitioning through the orange level that to me is the key step that's missing in the most projects that fail to integrate public and private financing that could be provided as a way of helping project planners get projects ready for a marketplace that would be prepared to provide investments for the work that they're doing. And then 2 tiers of rarely tapped resources in the private sector finance marketplace that I think have great potential for our field. The first is impact investment, which is largely focused on projects that have strong demonstrations of social benefit or environmental benefit. These are the things that attract the primary sources of attraction of impact investors today. And heritage has hardly been able to break into that marketplace. We're beginning to see now more cultural sector projects that have to do with creative industries and with museums and performing institutions beginning to tap impact investment. And the rare case, like the one that Norma Barbacci just talked about, involving Conservatorio, where a company chooses to focus on heritage and to create its own list or agenda of social investments. And then at the top of the funding pool
de esta lista de financiación, tenemos las inversiones senior, que están enfocadas en propiedades que generan ganancias.
And that is the hardest tier to reach, but one that I think through structured planning could take an interest in projects, particularly banks and other kinds of institutional investors in their own geographical marketplaces. So let's move on to the next slide. I know that I'm talking a different language here from the one that others in this program and most of us working in the heritage preservation world are used to. But I think that it's important for us to understand what the expectations are from investors at different levels and how to integrate their needs and their goals into the work that we're trying to find funding for. So this presents a range of different kinds of risks that are a source of an obstacle for investors that put them off and make them feel that it's not going to be worthy of their time and effort and too much of a risk to invest in heritage. I think the primary and most important risk is one that involves a coordination between the public and private sector, and particularly public policies that align with the viability of investment. Many of the policies surrounding heritage conservation and most of the regulations that have been created in the past have had as their rationale the defense of the patrimony and particularly public management. And so as the needs of the field migrate, with cities getting larger, with urban populations needing more social services, with the integration of those needs and priorities on the part of the public sector with the changes in the built environment, it's really important, I think, at this stage, critical that we revisit public policy and find ways to create frameworks that are easier to manage and that deliver, remove the obstacles that sometimes impede private investment. And the things that investors are put off by are bureaucracy of regulations, which impose delays, which are costly for private investment. The high cost of intervention in relation to heritage buildings because of the high level of technology needed in relation to new construction. Low volume that historic heritage represents compared to a large-scale urban development project that may involve the creation of a large number of new buildings and infrastructure. It's actually easier to find large-scale investment than it is to find individuals ready to put resources into a single building or small group of buildings. And the long trajectory that's needed in order to recover funds that are invested, which we typically estimate at 10 years or so, which is a long period of time for investors to hold on to investment before seeing a return. And on the other side, public officials are typically put off by investors. They're not necessarily trained to meet the demands that investors impose. They're often not equipped to do so because of the regulatory systems that they work within. Public agencies often end up holding properties that are underutilized or abandoned, and the terms of their ownership make it impossible for them to divest those properties or use them more productively. And sometimes public policies even impede public agencies for entering into negotiations at all with the private sector. So these are some of the obstacles that we see and need to overcome. And I'm not even going to talk about the ones at the lower end of the scale that have to do with environmental obstacles, implementation issues, and concentration of investments, because all of these are things that can be overcome by planning. And in fact, the goal is not necessarily to mitigate all the risks that investors face, but simply to make the marketplace as viable as possible. And that's often through incentives, as Norma Barbacci has already made reference to, and other kinds of enabling arrangements, such as expediting permissions and making it easier for investors to work in this marketplace. But there are investors who will cross over and get involved with the conservation of these assets. And it's often for reasons that are not purely economic. They may be motivated by an emotional attachment, a sense of obligation in relation to a specific property. Maybe it's something that has been in family ownership for a long time, out of a sense of civic pride, or because they see the social value of the return on investment and are willing to take a smaller profit in relation to the benefits that a given project is bringing to society. And so could I have the next slide, please? That is the motivation for impact investors. And for this reason, it's extremely important for us at this stage of the development in our field to find ways to produce metrics for showing how preservation projects provide social and economic impacts and transparent governance frameworks that impactors are looking for. These metrics need to be very precise. And the truth is that most investors are used to looking at global metrics and statistics, not at much smaller outputs and outcomes that come from individual projects. But I think nevertheless, it's available, it's possible to design projects with specific outcomes foreseen that have to do with community benefits, social development, job creation, equity, and translate those through existing systems of metrics that exist in both the architectural marketplace and the impact investing marketplace, in order to make a case of how individual projects relate to overall global sustainable development. And if we are serious about getting a wider range of sources of income directed toward heritage preservation, we have to find ways to produce these metrics. I think there are many people around the world working on that topic and that issue, particularly in relation to environmental conservation and the impact that saving buildings has on urban fabric, as opposed to construction, which causes a great deal of waste. And so I think that we can more or less anticipate that these metrics will be available to us in the relatively near future. But producing a really convincing social metrics is more of a challenge, and one that I think it would be extremely valuable for institutions working in the cultural heritage field to focus on for the future. So now I want to turn to a methodology that I have been working with other colleagues, including Norma and Juan Pablo de la Puente, who will be speaking later in the course of this program today, that I think can be applied to just about any situation. It's a simple process that goes beyond the conservation planning process that so many institutions are used to and engaged in order to place the outcomes of a conservation program in an economic framework that will then help the project sponsor evaluate the potential for attracting outside investments. So the first step is creating a vision and strategy that involves reviewing the conditions, identifying existing enabling factors and incentives that may exist in a given environment already and how well they're working. Selecting a group of projects that represent different building types in order to create well-written guidelines that can help with expediting the approval process. And of course, consulting stakeholders along the way in order to develop a high-level vision of what a given conservation initiative that's assuming that it wants to attract funding from across the spectrum of different kinds of sources can be constructed. The second step is to place that strategy within the larger geographical framework in order to identify the scope of the project and how many buildings, what size area could potentially be framed as part of a given initiative. And this is the point at which the metric and impact assessment metrics will be written, what the criteria are for identifying, for collecting information, and how a system can be put in place to collect metrics over a relatively long period of time, as long as a decade, while the project comes to its full fruition in terms of return on investment. Out of that larger scale planning comes a financial model that includes a business plan, what kinds of money earning and opportunities are there in the given environment, what's the likelihood that things will go wrong, what's the relative security of a certain kind of business as opposed to starting a new business initiative from scratch, who are the partners and investors that might be interested, and where will seed funding come from in order to get this model off the ground with a few pilot projects. And then the final step in the process is creating a management framework that can be responsive to all the players that are going to be engaged together in the initiative. Public offices typically don't have the staff resources to take on new responsibilities in terms of responding to the needs of private sector partners. And so there needs to be a very clear definition of roles, who does what, who is going to prime the pump when obstacles are reached. Is there somebody at a very high level in the political environment who is giving the guarantee that they are supporting the project and they want to see it succeed and they want to expedite it in any way that they can? The management framework can have a number of different characters. It can be a public agency or a public entity that is created for the purpose of implementing a given project or operating on a long-term basis in a geographical environment like a city. It can be a private company that has taken the lead and has reached out to the public sector to collaborate and to help facilitate their efforts and to help them with incentives that make it more financially viable. Or it could be a nonprofit organization or a hybrid that brings together both for-profit and nonprofit. But at the outset, I think critically, it will need resources to get up and running. It's not likely that an existing public entity can simply take on a vast amount of additional work in order to orchestrate a public-private partnership. And so this management framework needs to be planned carefully, authorized using within the context of local legal frameworks, and financed through at least the first stage of its existence, after which time it may become self-sustaining. And so the image that you're looking at now, called Pillars of Cooperation, puts these different entities together in a framework that helps them to coordinate their different roles. The roles of government are typically the same, whether it's the national government or the municipal level, but the way they interact in a given project framework is different. And typically, municipal government will be responsible for activities that involve infrastructure and public well-being in general, facilitating traffic control and other things that are going to be critical to the success of the Heritage Conservation Initiative when it's operational. On the private side, there are a range of people who may have nothing in common with each other, but who have in common an interest in the future of the environment, and who may be sponsoring individual projects, each on their own without any coordination, but which are dependent on government authorizations and on collaborative work from the governmental sector. And in the center of this temple is the national government agency that has regulatory authority over the cultural assets and cultural properties in the site, and who perform an essential role of coordination. Just about all the private investors that we've talked to over the course of conducting research, the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance has done, some of it under sponsorship from the Inter-American Development Bank. And I think that project is something that Juan Pablo will be talking about. The private investors that we talked to emphasize the key role of program coordination by the government agency that authors permits. And this function is sometimes referred to across the world as an open window that allows all of the people who are involved in a project to get what they need in order to carry out the work that they need to do. Could we go on to the next image, please? I think there are about two more. Yeah, so this is not a model of the management agency, but a depiction of the role that it plays in bringing projects out of the grassroots that may be brought forward by public authorities that have to do with monuments that may integrate public use edifices like museums and libraries, residential properties and commercial properties, every kind of potential use that historic assets have. Bring those through a process that helps them to create a framework for investment and manage the step-by-step process of monitoring and that framework, and communicating as well outwards to the public at large and to all the players in the initiative, and bringing those projects to a higher level marketplace where there are a range of different kinds of entities that may become involved in part of the financial equation, from equity investors who are only looking for a return on investment, to lenders who may be providing upfront capital at very advantageous rates in order to get projects started, and a range of other kinds of providers of funding. All that needs to be orchestrated as an overall plan. And can we go on to the next? I'm using an image here that I borrowed from a colleague who was involved in a similar kind of research program sponsored by the European Union, and something that, if you're interested in this idea of how to secure wider financing, you might want to have a look at the documents that the CLEAK project of the EU has created. But the Professor Tracy Pickrell from the Technical University in Dublin envisioned this kind of vortex of different kinds of funding sources, which you can see the different descriptions in this circle, all circling around that central management agency or financial intermediary that can take the pull together these resources for a given project and take the project from the grassroots and into the financial marketplace in order to create this kind of blended finance that is the goal of impact investing and sustainable development financing today. And I think I have a quick closing. Next slide. On Chifa's idea of using a revolving fund, which is fairly common practice and fairly common instrument for startup financing for heritage projects in the United States and also in parts of Europe, where funds are put out for developing investment readiness for projects that can produce a return on investment through earned income over time, providing second stage loans to bring those to a certain point that they become attractive to a wider range of investors. And then backing out of the proposition when a project has reached the point that it's earning its own revenue or becomes financeable. And one more image from me, which is just a picture of the two publications, if you want to go to the final slide, that Chifa has produced in the last year that, first of all, put forward the idea of heritage as a form of development, sustainable development within the context of the future of our urban cities. And then the group of case studies that Norma has discussed in part and Juan Pablo will be talking about further, that we used to identify a spectrum of different kinds of financing models that can be applied today. I'm going to have to go as soon as I complete this presentation, which is more or less now. But if there's anyone who wants to ask me a question before I go, please let me know. I think I see one in the chat. Why doesn't this economic analysis take more into account the intangible aspects of culture? I think that's all part of the social and environmental value assessment that's part of the entire sustainable development SDG assessment that needs to be done and is critical to creating a case for financing. And I don't mean to downplay the importance of supporting the intangible and existing community uses of heritage sites and cities as part of this framework. And I apologize that this presentation has been so completely focused on financing, but it's I think it's a neglected aspect of our work and one that needs to be better harmonized with heritage management systems that exist. So thank you so much for your attention. And I'm sorry to leave you quickly. If anyone would like to, has further questions and wants to send me an email, I'd be happy to answer it. Thank you.